Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain had started before the lamps came on. It wasn't heavy yet, just a soft, thoughtful drizzle, the kind that paints the windows with small, trembling beads. Inside, the room held the warm hush of evening. A pot of tea sat on the wooden table, steam rising in thin silver threads. The lamplight glowed softly, catching the dust that floated lazily in the air. Everything smelled faintly of bergamot and rain-soaked earth. They sat by the window, hands wrapped around the mug, listening. The rain fell with no rush, no rhythm it needed to prove. It was patient, and in that patience, something inside began to slow down too. The day had been long, too many thoughts trying to fit into too little time. Deadlines, unfinished words, unread messages. Now, only the sound of rain filled the space where noise had been. There was a quiet wish forming beneath that sound. A wish not for clarity or answers, but for calm. They wanted to learn what it meant to wait without anxiety, to let things unfold without trying to control their timing. The storm tonight felt like a small teacher. On the window glass, drops merged and split apart like tiny conversations. A reflection of the lamp trembled among them, a small imitation of fire. Each drop's journey hesitant, then certain felt strangely familiar. Life, too, often began with hesitation. They leaned closer to the glass, tracing the faint line of a raindrop with one finger. It slid downward, leaving a narrow path of clarity behind it. Through that path, they could see the blurred streetlight outside, haloed in gold and rain. Somewhere down there, water collected in quiet gutters, carrying leaves and dust and fragments of the day away. The house made its own soft music wood creaking, kettle cooling, the faint hum of distant thunder. They thought of how many nights had passed like this without being noticed. How often they had hurried through the hours, measuring the day by tasks completed instead of breaths taken. Tonight would be different. Tonight, there was nowhere to be but here. They took a sip of tea. The warmth met the chill of their fingers, settling somewhere behind the ribs. Outside, a wind lifted, brushing the window pane with invisible fingertips. It carried the scent of wet soil and blooming jasmine from the garden below. They closed their eyes. For a moment, the boundaries between inside and outside blurred. The lamplight, the rain, the heartbeat, the quiet. It all blended into one patient rhythm. Somewhere deep down, they remembered a saying their grandmother used to whisper on stormy nights. Don't run from the rain. Let it teach you how to wait. The words returned now like an echo from a far, safe place. Maybe patience wasn't a skill to be mastered, but a softness to be allowed. Maybe it was about trusting that the clouds knew when to open, that the heart would heal in its own time, that tomorrow would arrive exactly when it should. The tea had cooled. The rain grew steadier, no longer hesitant, but sure of its presence. The sound wrapped around the house like a blanket. They placed the mug down, drew the blanket closer around their shoulders, and let their thoughts drift. For the first time in a long while, the silence between each drop didn't feel empty. It felt full of promise, of surrender, of quiet waiting. Outside, thunder rolled distantly low, tired, gentle. Inside, a calm voice whispered without words. You don't have to fix anything tonight. Just listen. The rain answered with a sigh against the glass. They remembered the umbrella that still hung behind the door, small, blue, and a little frayed at the edges. It had been with them for years, a quiet companion through countless drizzles and sudden downpours. The fabric had faded from a deep navy to something gentler, like the color of a calm dusk. Every raindrop that had touched it seemed to have left a memory behind. They reached for it now, almost without thinking, and ran a thumb along the wooden handle. The surface was smooth from use, the kind of texture that only time and touch could create. It wasn't just an umbrella. It was a piece of their history, a reminder of simpler storms once faced and survived. They remembered the day they found it, in a small shop tucked between a florist and an old bakery on the corner of a street that no longer existed as it did then. The rain had been heavier that afternoon, a sharp silver curtain against the windows. They were younger, hurrying, impatient, still believing that every delay was an obstacle to fight. They had ducked into the shop just to escape getting soaked, not realizing how that small pause would stay with them for years. The shop smelled of cedar and old books. A radio played quietly somewhere in the back, a tune that seemed too gentle for the weather outside. The shopkeeper, a woman with kind eyes and a voice like rain on paper, had smiled when they entered. "Storms always make people rush," she'd said softly, "but rain doesn't mind being slow." Those words lingered even now. Rain doesn't mind being slow. They bought the umbrella that day, mostly because it was the only blue one left, but also because something about its color felt like calm. When they stepped back outside, the rain had eased just enough to make the world shimmer. Puddles caught the glow of passing lights, and people moved more carefully, almost gracefully, as if the storm had taught them how to walk with gentleness. They opened the umbrella and felt the small, comforting drum of raindrops above. For a moment, it was as if the world had given permission to pause, to breathe beneath the shelter of something fragile, yet reliable. Years later, the same umbrella had shielded them from many kinds of storms, not just the weathered kind. Breakups, disappointments, unanswered calls, the slow unraveling of dreams. Each time, they would walk under its fading blue canopy, listening to the rain's rhythm until the ache softened. It had taught them something that no advice ever could, that not all storms need to be escaped. Some are meant to be walked through, slowly, with care. Tonight, as the rain tapped gently outside, they smiled faintly at the thought. How strange that an object so ordinary could hold so much quiet wisdom. The umbrella had been patient when they couldn't be. It had waited through years of neglect in the corner, never asking to be noticed, just ready whenever needed. They set it gently beside the chair, like greeting an old friend. The sound of rain against the roof deepened, becoming steady, confident. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. Not a threat, but a reminder of the sky's voice. They took another sip of tea and watched how the window blurred the world into watercolor. Behind that blur was a small promise. Storms never last, and every drop eventually finds its way to calm. A memory surfaced then, walking home, one night after an argument that left them quiet for weeks. The streets had been empty, the rain relentless. Yet, under that little blue umbrella, they had felt strangely safe. The anger had softened into sadness, then into acceptance. The rhythm of rain had done what words could not. Maybe patience isn't about waiting for sunshine. Maybe it's about learning to stand in the rain without losing your warmth. They closed their eyes again. The image of that blue umbrella, flickering behind their lids like a lantern in the dark. Small, but steady. Outside, the storm began to hum a deeper note, the kind that makes the walls tremble softly. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant thunder. The umbrella stayed near, leaning against the chair, ready for whenever they would need to step outside again. They didn't rush to pick it up. Not tonight. There was no place they had to be. For now, the rain was enough. The room had grown warmer as the night deepened. The rain had found its rhythm, a quiet symphony tapping against the glass, steady and certain. The lamp's glow pooled softly across the desk, brushing the pages of an open notebook and the rim of the teacup, now half empty. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and damp air, a scent that always felt like memory itself. They loved this room, especially when it rained. It wasn't large, just a simple space lined with books, plants, and soft fabrics, that carried the scent of home. The curtains were drawn halfway, enough to let the streetlight spill in through the droplets, clinging to the window. Each bead of water caught the glow and fractured it into tiny, trembling stars. They stood and stretched, the floor creaking beneath their bare feet, a sound they found comforting. Every piece of wood seemed to remember footsteps from other nights like this. Restless pacing, quiet journaling, stillness. The room didn't judge. It simply held space for whatever they brought into it. They walked to the shelf and lit a small candle. Its flame danced gently, a golden heartbeat against the soft blue of the storm outside. In its flicker, the shadows moved slowly along the walls, books leaning like old friends, a framed photograph of the sea, a wool scarf draped over the chair. Everything seemed to hum with quiet companionship. They inhaled deeply and sat again dot in the silence that followed. The rain became more than background sound. It became presence. It filled the pauses between their thoughts, smoothed out the edges of worry. Each droplet seemed to whisper, "You can rest now, Dot." They turned a page in the notebook, but didn't write. Instead, they traced a small ring of moisture left by the mug, watching how it spread like a slow tide before fading. The impermanence of it was soothing. Nothing lasted, not even stains, not even storms. They leaned back and let their gaze wander. The gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen blended with the rain's lullaby. Somewhere upstairs, a pipe clicked softly, the old house shifting in its sleep. And then, for no reason at all, they smiled. They thought about how the simplest things, the candlelight, the smell of tea, the hum of rain, could quiet a mind that had been running all day. Maybe peace wasn't something to find out there, in another city or another person. Maybe it began right here, in small rooms like this, on nights like this. They remembered how restless they used to be, always chasing what was next, measuring life by milestones, mistaking stillness for stagnation. But the rain had a way of teaching balance. You can't rush the clouds to move faster. You can't tell the puddles when to dry. You can only sit and listen. The candle flickered as a draft brushed through the slightly open window. They pulled the blanket closer around their shoulders, the soft fabric brushing their skin like a slow reassurance. A faint thunder rolled far away, not angry, just thoughtful. It reminded them that not all noise meant danger. Sometimes even storms have gentle voices. They took another sip of tea, now lukewarm, but still fragrant. They watched a single drop slide down the window, racing its reflection, merging into another before disappearing into the frame. They wondered how many nights had passed, just like this one, unremarkable, unrecorded, yet deeply human dot, and in that thought came a wave of calm. Maybe life didn't need to be remarkable to be meaningful. Maybe the quiet moments, the waiting, the breathing, the listening, were the true ones. The candle's flame steadied again, no longer flickering. The room, the rain, the warmth, all seemed to breathe in unison. They closed their notebook without writing a word. Some nights, words were unnecessary. Some nights were meant only to be felt. The thunder softened. The rain slowed just slightly, the drops farther apart now, like the heartbeat of someone drifting into sleep. They sat there a while longer, doing nothing, saying nothing, feeling everything. On the corner of the desk lay a letter, or rather, an envelope yellowed slightly by time, its flap still unsealed. The handwriting on the front was theirs, but from a version of themselves that felt distant now, like a photograph from another life. They had written it years ago and never sent it. Tonight, with rain pressing softly at the windows, the letter seemed to ask quietly to be remembered. They touched it gently. The paper was smooth but fragile, carrying a faint scent of old ink and cedar from the drawer it had slept in. They hesitated for a moment, as if opening it might disturb the calm, then unfolded it with care. The words, though familiar, felt like they belonged to someone else. Dear M. It began. The handwriting wavered a little, uncertain. They could almost hear their younger voice in those lines, softer, more hopeful, still believing that love alone could fix what patience could not. I wanted to say sorry for rushing you, for trying to pull the future closer before it was ready. I know now that waiting is its own kind of love. I hope wherever you are, the rain still sounds the same. They paused there, letting the words settle. The rain seemed to grow gentler, as if it too were listening. They remembered writing that letter after a long night of silence, when things had ended not with shouting, but with exhaustion. They had wanted closure then, wanted to explain, to justify, to make sense of something that didn't need explaining. But the letter had stayed in the drawer, unsent, as if deep down they already knew the message was meant only for themselves. That it wasn't regret that filled the room now, but understanding. Some words don't need to reach another person. They just need to be spoken somewhere safe. They read on. If we ever meet again, I hope it's during the rain. Not because it's poetic, but because storms remind me that endings can sound beautiful too. They smiled faintly. That line had once made them ache. Now, it only made them breathe a little deeper. The ache had softened into something gentle, gratitude, maybe, or peace. They folded the letter back carefully, smoothing the crease with their palm. There was no urge to mail it anymore. It had already done its work. On the desk, the candle had burned lower, the wax forming delicate rivers along its side. The flame still flickered, casting small shadows across the page, like ghosts of the past nodding their quiet goodbyes. They thought about how many things in life remain unfinished, letters, conversations, dreams, and yet somehow the world continues, the rain continues, hearts continue. Perhaps that was what patience really was, not waiting for things to be perfect, but accepting that even unfinished moments can be complete in their own way. They placed the letter back in its envelope and slipped it into the drawer once more. The sound of it closing was soft, final, but kind. Then they turned back toward the window. The storm outside had shifted. The rain was heavier now, steady enough to blur the garden into a watercolor wash of greens and silvers. The reflection of the lamp trembled faintly on the wet glass. They imagined that somewhere out there, the person the letter was meant for might be looking at the same kind of rain, different street, different life, but the same sky. And that thought felt enough docked. The clock ticked softly in the background, steady as breath. They poured the last of the tea into their cup, watching the thin steam rise and curl before fading into the air. It disappeared quickly, yet beautifully. Another small reminder that everything ends, and that's what makes it precious. They leaned their forehead lightly against the cool glass of the window. Outside, lightning flashed far away, lighting the clouds for just a moment before retreating back into the dark. The sound followed, not sharp, but low and thoughtful, rolling through the sky like a sigh. They whispered softly to no one in particular. I hope you waited out your storm. The room didn't answer, but the rain did, a tender rhythm against the pane, as if saying, I did. And so did you? They smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, and stayed there a while longer, watching the sky breathe. They woke before dawn once, years ago, when the storm had been louder than it was tonight. The memory came back to them now, with the same texture, gray light, soaked streets, and a sky still undecided between night and morning. That day had begun with the sound of rain beating against the roof and a restlessness they couldn't name. By evening, they had found themselves walking toward the pier, umbrella in hand, not to go anywhere in particular, but because the rain felt like a conversation, they needed to join. The pier had always been quiet after storms. The air there smelled of salt and metal, seaweed and forgotten things. Water clung to the wooden planks, turning them dark and smooth. Gulls called somewhere far off, voices thin in the heavy wind. They remembered the feeling of the umbrella handle in their palm, slippery with rain, the sound of drops drumming above like an old heartbeat. Every step toward the sea felt like an act of listening, to the rain, to the waves, to the parts of themselves that didn't know how to speak. That evening followed a difficult week. Too many things ending at once. A friendship lost, a plan falling apart, a version of life that no longer fit. They had walked without direction, as if movement alone might rinse the ache away. But when they reached the pier, something unexpected happened. They stopped Dot, and for the first time, stopping didn't feel like giving up. The ocean was gray and endless, rising and falling with slow grace. The horizon blurred where sea met sky, like the boundary between thought and feeling. The storm hadn't fully passed. Rain still fell in fine mist, soft and persistent. But instead of running for cover, they had closed the umbrella and tilted their face upward. Cold drops touched their cheeks, their lashes. They stood there, letting the water find them. It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was something quieter, the realization that the world didn't pause for sorrow. The waves moved, the rain fell, the gulls cried, all indifferent yet tender in their rhythm. Life went on. They remembered how their hands had trembled slightly from the chill, how their shoes had filled with water, how a single beam of sunlight had pierced the clouds for just a heartbeat before disappearing again. That sliver of light had been enough. It had whispered something wordless but real. Even this will pass. Back in the present, sitting by the same window years later, they could still feel that moment, the taste of rain, the salt in the air, the calm that had followed. Maybe patience wasn't learned through comfort, but through surrender. Maybe peace was what remained when you stopped trying to control the weather. They glanced toward the blue, umbrella resting beside the chair now. Its fabric still bore faint salt stains from that evening by the sea. Each mark was a story of standing still when running seemed easier. The thunder murmured again outside, low and tired. The candle flame bent slightly, as if owing to it. They thought of how many times they had waited since then. For clarity, for healing, for someone to return. Waiting had once felt like emptiness. Now it felt like practice. They remembered breathing in time with the ocean that day, matching the rhythm of their chest to the tide. In, out, rise, fall. Even now, that rhythm stayed with them when the world became too loud. It was something the sea had given freely, the reminder that balance doesn't come from stillness alone, but from movement that doesn't hurry. A train horn echoed faintly in the distance, carried by the wet wind. They imagined the rails shining under the rain, stretching somewhere toward morning. In the glass reflection, their face looked softer, lines of time illuminated by candlelight. They no longer searched for what was lost. They simply watched the rain, the way one watches a friend breathe in sleep. The pier was far away now, but its lesson lingered. They didn't need to go back there to remember it. The patience learned beside that restless sea lived quietly in them, resurfacing on nights like this, whenever storms returned. They exhaled slowly, a long breath that felt like release. Outside, the rain thinned to a mist again, the world behind the window shimmering like the edge of a memory. They whispered to the night, "I'm not afraid of storms anymore." And in answer, a small gust of wind brushed the window, scattering the last raindrops down the glass like applause. Sometimes, when the rain lingered for days, they liked to imagine that it carried stories, fragments of lives whispered between clouds, fragments that fell to earth in soft syllables of water. On nights like this, when everything slowed down enough to listen, they could almost hear them. The rain spoke in layers. Beneath the steady rhythm on the window, there were softer sounds, the patter on leaves, the trickle through the gutters, the hush as droplets met puddles and vanished into them. Each sound held a memory. Laughter from a street corner years ago. A goodbye spoken under a gray sky. A child's bright voice chasing after a paper boat. The rain remembered everything, they thought. It just never told anyone out loud. They leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, letting the melody weave through the room. The candle had burned lower, its light flickering like a heartbeat almost at rest. The scent of wax mixed with the smell of rain and old paper, wrapping the space in something tender and weightless. They thought about all the storms they'd lived through, not the kind that soaked the streets, but the ones that passed quietly through the mind. Arguments that stayed unfinished, choices that couldn't be undone, losses that left no visible scar, but changed everything nonetheless. Those storms had felt endless once. Yet here they were, years later, still breathing, still making tea, still listening to rain. Maybe that was what the rain wanted to remind them, that every life holds both thunder and silence, and both are necessary. They opened the window a little wider. Cool air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of wet jasmine. The wind brushed the curtain like a hand reaching out. Somewhere below, water dripped steadily from the eaves onto the garden stones, a rhythm too patient to rush. They thought of a story their grandmother once told, about how raindrops never fall in the same place twice. Each one carries a different tale, she had said. You just have to listen closely enough to hear which one belongs to you. At the time, it had sounded like magic. Now, it felt like truth. Every storm in their life had said something different. Be still. Let go. Begin again. They hadn't always listened, but somehow they'd learned. They closed their eyes. The sounds around them became a kind of lullaby. The rain softened the edges of thought until all that remained were small, vivid images. A smile that once lingered in a cafe doorway, a train pulling away under wet lights, the blue umbrella resting open beside an ocean dot. Each memory was a drop, falling, fading, feeding something unseen beneath the surface of who they were. They took a slow breath. The air was cool enough to make them shiver, but it felt clean, like it had washed something invisible away. And for a fleeting moment, they understood that patience wasn't just waiting for storms to pass. It was learning to listen to them, to hear what they leave behind once the thunder fades. The candle flickered again, throwing brief shapes on the wall, the shadow of their hand, the outline of the umbrella, the curve of the window frame. The room seemed to breathe in sync with the rain. They whispered into the dim air, every drop has a story. Outside, a branch brushed against the glass, almost in response. They smiled. Maybe that was the reason they loved nights like this, the way everything seemed connected, how even loneliness could feel like belonging when the world moved in such quiet harmony. The storm was no longer something to wade through. It was something to share space with. They leaned their head against the chair, eyelids heavy. The rain kept talking softly, not demanding attention, just existing, steady, rhythmic, eternal. If it had words, they imagined it would say, "You're still here. You've always been." And that was enough. The rain had turned into a soft drizzle by the time they noticed how long they'd been sitting there. The candle's flame had melted nearly to its base, its last breath of light trembling in the quiet. They exhaled, long and slow, matching the rhythm of the rain. In, out, the kind of breathing that feels like forgiveness. It was something they had learned from a therapist years ago, how to breathe through restlessness instead of running from it. At the time, it had felt awkward, even foolish. But now, with the scent of rain in the air and the hush of the world outside, it made perfect sense. Every breath was a small act of trust, a way of telling the body, you can rest now. You're safe here. They closed their eyes and counted the inhalations, like slow waves brushing ashore. 1, 2, 3. Each one gathered up the noise in their chest and carried it away. The muscles in their shoulders loosened. The space between thoughts widened. Outside, the streetlights glowed faintly through mist. A passing car made the puddles sigh, and then everything was still again. They remembered how hard it used to be. To wait, to sit through uncertainty, to resist the impulse to fix what was still unfolding. Life had been a string of held breaths back then, each one chasing the next moment, the next answer. But storms had a way of teaching patience. You can't force them to end. You can only breathe through them until they decide to pass. Their grandmother used to say the rain knew the language of the heart. When you listen long enough, she'd smile, you'll realize it's breathing with you. They opened their eyes, and for a moment, they felt it, that shared rhythm between sky and soul. The rain wasn't falling on the world anymore. It was falling with it. The tea had gone cold. They lifted the cup anyway, feeling the porcelain cool against their palm. It grounded them, the small weight of it, the memory of warmth that had once been there. They looked toward the notebook on the desk. A few words had been scribbled earlier, not enough to form a story, just phrases. Quiet hands, patient rain, time untangling itself. They smiled at the thought. Maybe the words didn't need to go anywhere. Maybe they were just meant to exist, like breaths, like raindrops that a gust of wind passed through the half-open window, bringing with it the faint rustle of leaves. The curtains swayed softly, brushing against the candle's final flame. Shadows danced briefly across the wall, like ripples on water dock. They inhaled again, deeper this time. They felt the air move all the way down to their ribs, expanding, softening. And then they exhaled, slowly, deliberately, as if releasing the weight of years they hadn't noticed carrying. Each breath became a bridge between now and what came before, between who they were and who they were still becoming not. It struck them that patience wasn't always calm. Sometimes it trembled. Sometimes it ached. Sometimes it was a long, silent inhale you weren't sure you could finish. But in that trembling, there was still trust. Trust that something larger was moving, even when you couldn't see it. They thought of all the moments they had rushed through, the decisions made too quickly, the words spoken too soon, the silences that could have healed if only given more time. How many storms, they wondered, had they tried to outrun instead of simply standing beneath? Outside, a bird called softly from the dark, a single note, uncertain but brave. The drizzle answered with a hush, wrapping the sound in gentleness. They closed their eyes again. Their breathing was even now, their heartbeat steady. The candle sputtered once and went out, leaving the room lit only by the pale glow from the street, beyond Dot in the dimness. The sound of rain grew more vivid, more intimate, like a whisper spoken close to the ear. They whispered back, "I'm learning." And it was true. They were Dot learning to breathe with storms instead of fearing them. Learning that stillness wasn't the same as silence. Learning that peace wasn't the absence of weather, but the ability to stand within it. The rain continued, slow, steady, alive. The phone lay face down on the table, a faint rectangle of light, pulsing through its case whenever a new message arrived. It had been doing that for hours, quietly demanding attention, insisting on urgency. But tonight, they let it glow and fade, untouched. The world could wait. For once, there was no need to answer everything the moment it called. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper. It sounded like conversation without words, patient, calm, forgiving. The kind of sound that asked nothing from you, only that you stay and listen. They reached for the teapot and poured the last of the lukewarm tea into their cup. The liquid shimmered briefly before settling, a mirror of dim lamplight and drifting shadows. They could see their own reflection faintly, softened by the surface, eyes tired but gentle, a face finally free of the day's rush. There was a time, not long ago, when they couldn't bear quiet like this. Silence made them restless. It made them pick up the phone just to feel connected, to fill the space between breaths. Notifications had become a kind of heartbeat, and without them, they'd felt invisible. But the rain had a way of reminding you what presence really meant. It asked nothing, gave everything, and never hurried. Sitting here now, with the phone turned away, they realized how much peace could be found in simply doing nothing. They lifted the cup, feeling the cool porcelain against their fingertips, and took a slow sip. The taste was faint now, but familiar. Bergamot, honey, a hint of calm. On the shelf nearby, a small clock ticked softly, each second a gentle nudge forward. The sound didn't hurry them. It only reminded them that time, too, was patient. They thought of how much they used to chase. Replies, plans, answers. The phone had once been a lifeline, a way to feel seen, needed. But maybe being unreachable for a while wasn't loneliness. Maybe it was space, the kind where you could finally hear your own thoughts without them being drowned by everyone else's. They turned their gaze toward the window. Raindrops streaked the glass like thin threads of light, catching the glow of passing cars below. The city outside moved at its usual speed, but from here, behind the glass, it looked gentle, almost slow motion. They breathed in deeply. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement. How many moments like this had they missed? Chasing after noise, scrolling through endless updates, mistaking movement for meaning? It was strange how silence, once intimidating, now felt like company. A soft chime came from the phone again. Another message, another name. They didn't look. Instead, they traced the rim of the teacup with one finger, following the small circle, as if it contained the whole world. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly. Not near enough to threaten, just enough to remind them that storms still existed beyond the window, just as the world still existed beyond their quiet. They smiled. Maybe life didn't require constant conversation. Maybe the most important parts happened in stillness, between replies, between heartbeats, between drops of rain. They stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. Their reflection blended with the outside world. A blur of lamplight, water, and the faint outline of a person learning how to be here, fully without distraction. Their hand brushed the glass. Coolness met warmth, inside meeting out. They thought about a phrase they'd once written in a forgotten journal. Presence isn't about showing up everywhere. It's about being completely somewhere. The phone chimed again. This time, they smiled and reached forward, not to answer, but to turn it off. The screen went dark, the room immediately deeper in its quiet. Only the rain remained, whispering its steady hymn against the glass. The world felt wider now, as if silence itself had opened a door. They returned to their chair, drew the blanket around their shoulders, and let the emptiness of the room settle into something peaceful. No voices, no urgency, no light but the soft gold of the lamp and the silver reflection of rain. They closed their eyes, the faint rhythm of the storm sinking with their pulse dot in the distance. Another phone, maybe from a neighboring apartment, buzzed faintly, then fell quiet again. For the first time in a long while, the silence between all those sounds didn't feel lonely. It felt whole. They exhaled slowly and thought, not everything needs an answer tonight. And outside, as if agreeing, the rain kept falling, patient, even endless. The old journal was tucked between two forgotten novels on the lowest shelf. Its spine cracked, its edges curled like autumn leaves. They hadn't opened it in years, maybe decades. But something about the night, the rhythm of the rain, the silence of the phone, made them reach for it. Dust lifted softly as they pulled it free. The cover was worn leather, the kind that had once been a deep brown, but had faded to the color of warm earth. The first page carried their name in faded ink, written in a hand that seemed younger, more eager. They smiled, touching the letters gently, as if greeting an old friend. They flipped through the pages. The handwriting changed over the years, slanted in some parts, careful in others, like the tide of a mind learning how to grow. Notes, sketches, half-finished poems. Grocery lists that somehow shared space with late-night reflections about love, loneliness, and what it meant to wait for something without knowing if it would ever come. They paused at a page marked by a pressed flower, pale and thin, almost transparent now. Beneath it, in small, neat letters, were the words, "Patience is not a pause. It's faith with quiet hands." They didn't remember writing that, but it felt like something they would have needed to hear. They leaned back in the chair, the journal open on their lap, and listened as the rain shifted from steady to gentle again, a lull between rhythms. The house was utterly still. The entries told stories of a person learning to wait, for love to return, for grief to fade, for life to make sense. They read about nights when storms had felt unbearable, when they had sat in the same room clutching the same journal, afraid of the silence that now comforted them. They smiled at one line, written in hurried ink. Maybe the sky isn't angry when it storms. Maybe it's just trying to speak. They closed their eyes and let that thought settle. How young they had been, believing that every difficult thing needed meaning, every storm a message. Now they understood that sometimes things simply happen, and that was okay. Meaning, like sunlight after rain, arrived quietly, on its own time. Flipping forward, they found a later entry, the handwriting calmer, rounder. It began, "I am learning to be kind to my waiting self." They traced that sentence with a fingertip. Maybe that was the hardest lesson of all, to offer kindness not to others, but to the parts of yourself still becoming. The rain picked up again, tapping like a slow heartbeat against the window. The scent of damp soil drifted in through the small crack of the open pane. They looked around the room, the candle now a small pool of wax, the umbrella leaning patiently by the door, the untouched phone. Everything seemed to belong here, like companions to the act of remembering. They thought of how this journal had once been their voice when speaking felt impossible. Pages had absorbed what conversations could not. Fear, hope, gratitude, confusion. It had never judged, only listened. Maybe that was what patience was, a kind of listening. To the rain, to the heart, to the silence between both. They read one more page. The date was nearly 10 years old. It said, "One day I'll look back and realize the waiting was the becoming." They closed the journal slowly, pressing the cover shut with both hands. That day, they thought, might be tonight. The lamplight flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the storm hummed softly, like an old tune returning after many years. They set the journal beside them on the desk, its presence grounding, warm. The rain continued to fall, not as noise, but as rhythm, as memory, as something alive. They whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you for waiting with me." It wasn't clear who they were speaking to, the journal, the rain, or their younger self, but it didn't matter. All three had stayed, and for the first time in a long while, they felt whole, not because everything was complete, but because they had learned to cherish what wasn't. They leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the sound of the storm carry them gently through time, back to who they had been, and forward to whoever they were still becoming. They didn't expect to think about the stranger from the hallway again. Yet as the rain deepened, memories found their way through like quiet visitors. It had been years ago, in an old apartment building with flickering lights and thin walls. They had been carrying groceries, head down, distracted by the weight of too many thoughts, when someone said softly, "You dropped this." It was a stranger, an older man, perhaps 60, wearing a brown coat too big for him, and holding out a fallen apple, that had rolled from their bag. His eyes had been kind, his voice calm in that way some people speak when they've already made peace with life's noise. They'd smiled awkwardly, muttered thanks, and hurried to take the apple back. But he had only shaken his head and said, "No hurry. The rain's not stopping anytime soon." They both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. That was the first conversation. Over time, they began to see him often, in the hallway, by the mailboxes. Sometimes on the front steps with a book in his hands, while the rain whispered over the city. He never spoke much. Sometimes he'd simply nod, as if saying hello was enough. Other times, he'd mention small things, how the jasmine on the balcony had finally bloomed, or how the rain sounded softer after midnight, it was nothing remarkable. And yet those brief exchanges had felt like anchors in a world that spun too quickly. There was something grounding about being seen quietly, without expectation. One night, when the rain was heavier than usual, they both ended up waiting in the narrow hallway. Umbrellas dripping, shoes squeaking against the tile. The power had flickered out, leaving only the sound of the storm and the faint light of the exit sign. He had chuckled softly. "You know," he'd said, "people keep waiting for storms to pass before they go on living. But sometimes the living happens in the storm." They'd never forgotten that. When the lights came back, he'd smiled at them gently, like someone handing over a truth too fragile to speak twice. Weeks later, he moved out, or maybe passed away. They were never sure. His mailbox was empty one morning, the nameplate gone. The hallway seemed wider after that, but lonelier too. Still, every time it rained, they thought of it. Not as someone they lost, but as someone who left a quiet kind of wisdom behind. That stillness doesn't mean waiting for calm skies, but learning how to walk softly in the rain. Tonight, the memory returned like an echo through time. They could almost hear his voice again, that gentle rhythm against the storm. They stood and crossed the room, pausing at the window. The rain outside looked the same as it had that night in the hallway. Endless, silver, alive. They imagined the old man somewhere beyond it, maybe sitting by his own window, reading a book, his umbrella drying by the door. Perhaps he had found another hallway, another rain. They smiled faintly and whispered, "You were right. The living does happen here." Outside, the streetlight flickered briefly before glowing steady again, its light bending through the water, running down the glass. The reflection of the room merged with the city's blurred colors, the candle, the journal, their quiet figure by the window, all part of one slow, breathing image. They thought about how kindness can last longer than memory, how a few words spoken gently can follow you for years, resurfacing when you need them most. The rain shifted direction with the wind, brushing harder against the glass. It didn't sound harsh. It sounded honest, the way truth often does. They reached for the blue umbrella, leaning near the door, touching its worn handle. "Some people," they murmured, "are umbrellas too. Small shelters we carry with us long after they're gone." The thunder rolled low in the distance, and the sound didn't frighten them. It felt almost like applause. They stood there a while longer, letting the storm speak its language, grateful for the memory of the man who had taught them that waiting was also a form of living. And when they finally returned to the chair, something inside them felt lighter, not because the storm was ending, but because they no longer needed it to. The rain had softened again, returning to that tender rhythm that always felt like forgiveness. Steam curled upward from a fresh cup of tea, winding lazily in the lamplight before vanishing into the still air. They cupped their hands around it, feeling the warmth spread slowly through their palms. The scent of bergamot rose with the steam, delicate and citrus sweet, mingling with the faint aroma of candle wax and damp wood. They thought about forgiveness, how it never arrived suddenly, never with fanfare. It came like this, quietly, like steam, forming and fading, until one day you realized the heaviness was gone. They had held on to so many small weights through the years, things left unsaid, apologies unspoken, mistakes revisited in the quiet hours. Some had faded naturally, but others lingered like ghosts in corners of the mind. Yet tonight, the rain made even those ghosts seem soft around the edges. They lifted the cup closer, watching the surface tremble with every distant roll of thunder. Forgiveness, they whispered, is a kind of warmth, not an absolution. Not forgetting, just warmth that lets you breathe again. They closed their eyes and imagined sitting across from everyone they'd ever needed to forgive, and everyone who had needed forgiveness from them. No grand speeches, no perfect endings. Just a shared cup of tea, steam curling between them, silence doing the talking. They imagined their younger self there too, impatient, anxious, always reaching. They smiled gently at that version of themselves, the one who believed storms were problems to be solved. You were doing your best, they thought. You just didn't know patience was a form of love. The candlelight shimmered on the walls, tracing the outlines of books and photographs, a quiet museum of all the people and moments that had shaped them. The rain's rhythm changed slightly, faster for a minute, then easing again, like breath finding balance. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't about others at all. It was about reclaiming the parts of yourself you left behind with them. They remembered a time they'd stood by the ocean, wind tearing at their coat, heart heavy with someone's leaving. They'd shouted into the waves, angry at the loss, at the silence, at themselves. But the sea had given no answer, only foam dissolving at their feet. Now, years later, they understood. The sea had answered. It had said, let go in its own language. The steam had thinned, leaving faint rings of condensation on the rim of the cup. They set it down and rested their hands on their knees, feeling the quiet pulse in their wrists. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed from the church at the end of the street, muffled by rain, but clear enough to count. 11 o'clock. Late, but not lonely dot, they drew a slow breath, the kind that fills the lungs completely, and exhaled until everything unnecessary left with it. For a moment, the air in the room felt lighter, the kind of stillness that follows a deep understanding. They whispered softly, I forgive you, not sure who it was meant for. Maybe everyone, maybe no one. The rain seemed to respond, drumming a little faster, like gentle applause. They smiled, imagining the world itself nodding in approval. On the windowsill, a drop of water slipped down the glass, leaving a clear path through the misted pane. They followed its trail with their eyes, noticing how it merged with another, then another, until it disappeared into the frame. Forgiveness, they thought, was like that one drop meeting another until everything became part of the same river dock. They leaned back in the chair, the blue umbrella still resting against the door, the journal still half open on the table. Everything they'd been carrying, regret, impatience, longing, seemed smaller now, manageable, almost tender. Outside, thunder grumbled softly, as if clearing its throat before silence. The rain slowed to a hush. They lifted the cup once more, took the last sip, and felt warmth settle low in their chest. Maybe storms weren't meant to be endured or escaped. Maybe they were simply spaces for forgiveness to find you. They closed their eyes and whispered into the quiet. Thank you, rain. And for a heartbeat, it sounded like the rain whispered back, you're welcome. The rain had quieted to a near silence now, the kind that almost felt like a held breath. The air outside shimmered faintly heavy with moisture, yet somehow lighter, as though the sky itself had been unburdened. They left the lamp burning low and moved toward the window. The glass was cool beneath their fingertips, and beyond it, the night looked newly washed. Drops clung to the edges of leaves, trembling but not falling. Every branch seemed to glisten with patience. Somewhere deep in the garden, a frog croaked once, then stopped, as if uncertain whether the storm was truly gone. They breathed in, and the air smelled of everything fresh earth, stone, rain-soaked wood, and that faint sweetness that only follows a long storm. It was the smell of beginnings. They whispered to themselves, letting time do its work. The words felt like a quiet prayer for so long. They had wanted to rush the process of healing, to know when it would all make sense, when the ache would fade, when clarity would arrive. But now, watching the trembling light outside, they finally understood that life moved like the weather. Slowly, unseen, always changing dot seeds grew in darkness long before they broke the surface. Leaves took weeks to unfurl. Rivers carved their own paths, one patient curve at a time. And people, well, people healed that way too. They returned to their chair and opened the old journal again. A blank page waited, pale under the candlelight. They hesitated at first, not knowing what to write, not wanting to disturb the stillness that had settled over the room. Then softly they began. Some things take time. Let them. The ink spread slightly into the fibers of the paper, like roots finding their way into soil. They looked at the sentence for a long moment, then smiled. It didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need to explain anything. It was enough. Outside, the rain began again, barely audible, just a thin lace of water brushing the roof. The sound wasn't a storm anymore. It was an afterthought, a reminder that even endings have echoes. They took a slow sip from their cup. The tea had gone cold, but it didn't matter. Warmth came now from somewhere else, from the quiet, from the understanding that not every silence needed to be filled. They thought about the people they had lost, the chances that had slipped away, the words they never said. Each one had been a seed, once buried under regret, watered by time. Some had bloomed into lessons. Others had simply dissolved into soil. Making space for new roots. They reached for the blue umbrella beside the door, unfolding it halfway, just to hear the soft click of the mechanism. The sound was oddly satisfying, like punctuation at the end of a thought. They imagined walking beneath it tomorrow morning, when the clouds began to clear the streets still wet, the air smelling of sky. They knew the world wouldn't be dramatically different. The same people, the same routines, the same questions would be waiting. But something inside them had shifted. It wasn't happiness exactly more like ease, acceptance, the sense that they no longer needed to force tomorrow to arrive sooner. They closed the umbrella gently and set it back against the wall. Time, they thought, doesn't need us to push it forward. It moves on its own. All we need to do is live inside it, to breathe, to wait, to notice the small miracles that unfold quietly when we stop trying to hurry them. A faint draft rushed through the room, swaying the candle flame. Its light bent, then straightened again, resilient. Alive, they whispered. Everything grows in its own season. The rain seemed to agree, its rhythm soft and sure. They leaned back, hands resting in their lap, eyes on the small circle of light cast by the candle. Around them, the room felt timeless, neither past nor future, just now. And now, they realized, was more than enough. When thunder finally returned, it didn't sound like before. It wasn't the fierce kind that cracked through the sky, startling the windows and waking sleeping hearts. It came softly this time, a low, slow murmur, like someone clearing their throat before a song. The storm was ending, yes, but not with drama. It was leaving gently, as if it didn't want to wake anyone. They sat still and listened. The air inside the room had cooled, and the candle's flame flickered slower now, shorter, quieter. The scent of wax and rain mixed into something tender, a perfume of calm endings. Through the window, the clouds were breaking apart. Patches of dark blue peeked through, and far on the horizon, a faint glow suggested the first hint of dawn. The thunder rolled once more, even softer, like a giant exhaling. They smiled. When thunder softens to hush, they whispered, maybe that's when peace begins. They closed the journal and laid it on the desk, palms resting on its warm cover. The wood beneath it was cool and smooth, grounding them in the moment. For the first time in a long while, their thoughts didn't rush ahead to what came next. They simply stayed. They looked around the room, the teapot empty, the blue umbrella leaning quietly by the door, the faint circle of wax on the table. Everything was still, as if the room itself had decided to rest. A memory surfaced then, a childhood one. They were small, sitting beside their grandmother during a storm much like this. She had held their hand and whispered, "Don't be afraid. The sky only growls before it sleeps." They had laughed then, a little scared but comforted by her calm. She had poured tea and hummed a tune that had no words, just a melody that rose and fell with the rain. And when the thunder faded, she'd smiled and said, "See? Even storms get tired." Now, decades later, that memory wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Maybe that was what patience really was. Not waiting for fear to disappear, but holding yourself gently until it does dot outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. Each drop landed softly on the leaves, their rhythm unhurried. Somewhere, a streetlight buzzed faintly, as if trying to decide whether to stay on or give way to the morning. They opened the window a little wider. Cool air slipped in, brushing their cheeks, carrying the faint hum of the waking world. The first car passing in the distance. A dog shaking off water. A bird testing its voice. The thunder rolled one last time, barely audible, fading into a deep, endless silence. The kind of silence that fills you instead of empties you. They breathed it and got how strange. They thought that storms could leave behind such gentleness. The world outside looked washed clean, the air sharp and alive. Even the lamplight seemed softer now, as if it too had learned something from the night. They thought of the stranger from the hallway, of the letter unsent, of the journal, of every version of themselves who had waited, hoped, and endured. All those fragments now gathered quietly in the same room, at peace with each other. The candle finally gave a last small sigh and went out. Smoke rose in a thin silver thread, curling upward toward the ceiling. It looked like a soul leaving something it no longer needed to hold on to. They whispered, "Thank you for staying." It wasn't clear who they were thanking. The storm, the silence, or themselves, but it didn't matter. Gratitude didn't always need direction. It just needed to be felt. Outside, the world was still dripping, still gleaming, still humming softly. They stood, stretched, and looked out once more. The clouds were thinning fast now, revealing the wide, pale sky beneath. It was the color of promise, quiet, endless, forgiving. They smiled faintly. The storm had done its work, Doc, and as the last echo of thunder melted into hush, they felt something inside them mirror it, a long, slow exhale they hadn't realized they'd been holding for years. Peace didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with surrender. The storm was gone by morning, leaving only traces, a few puddles glowing like mirrors, the scent of wet grass drifting through the air, the hush that always follows the night's rain. The world outside their window seemed newly made, every surface shining, every leaf bowed in quiet gratitude. They stood there for a long moment, hand resting lightly on the sill, watching a single drop of water slide down the glass until it vanished into the frame. They opened the window wider. Cool air entered gently, brushing their skin with the freshness of something beginning again. The curtains stirred, soft and slow, like a sigh released from the heart of the house. Somewhere nearby, a bird called once, tentative, testing the stillness. They smiled. After the noise, this silence felt sacred. The umbrella still leaned by the door, a little damp around the edges, catching a stripe of sunlight through the curtains. They walked toward it, running a hand along the handle, remembering how it had once shielded them, not just from rain, but from restlessness, from rushing. It was strange how even the simplest object could hold the whole story. They carried it to the window, opened it halfway, and let it catch the light. Drops of water clung to its fabric, glowing like small stars. Then, slowly, they turned it upside down and set it on the floor. Letting the sun dry it open, it was such a small thing, but it felt like a ritual, a quiet act of release. They made a new cup of tea, the first of the day. Steam rose, curling into sunlight. The world outside was alive again. Footsteps splashing through puddles, a door creaking somewhere, a child laughing faintly from the next street over. They sipped, warm liquid meeting cool morning air. It tasted like calm, like something that had been earned through the long night. They thought about how often people waited for grand moments, the big shifts, the clear signs, the sunlight after the storm. But maybe peace arrived in smaller ways. In the sound of drying leaves, the scent of soil, the warmth of a cup between your palms. Maybe healing wasn't a sunrise. Maybe it was the slow brightening of an ordinary morning. They turned their gaze upward. The sky was wider than they remembered, pale blue with faint threads of cloud still drifting lazily apart. It felt like the world was exhaling. Release can be tender, they murmured, half to themselves. There was no urgency left inside them, only the soft hum of existence. What needed to end had ended. What remained was enough. They closed their eyes and listened. The dripping from the eaves slowed to a single note, a soft plink against stone. The tea cooled in their hands, but they didn't mind. Warmth, they realized, wasn't something the body held. It was something the heart learned to keep. The faint smell of jasmine drifted through the open window, sweet and familiar. They remembered the old man from the hallway, mentioning how the flowers bloomed brighter after rain. They smiled, imagining his voice again, calm and kind. Maybe he was right. Maybe storms didn't destroy. They cleansed. They looked around the room one last time, the candle now just waxing wick, the journal closed, the phone still silent. Everything felt exactly as it should. Simple, lived in, at rest. They stepped back toward the window, leaning against the frame, watching as sunlight pooled slowly across the garden. A single droplet hung from the tip of a leaf, trembling but refusing to fall. It caught the light perfectly, holding the whole sky inside it. And then, as the breeze shifted, it let go. They watched it fall. Quick, graceful, free, and thought. Maybe that's what patience becomes in the end. Not waiting, not clinging, just the courage to open your hand when it's time. They smiled again, a small, quiet smile that felt like gratitude. The room was filled with golden light now, soft and forgiving. Outside, somewhere beyond the wet streets and open windows, a new day was beginning. Morning arrived softly, not in bursts of brightness, but in layers. A pale drizzle threading through silver clouds. The smell of damp air mixing with the faint sweetness of tea. The world was still wrapped in gray, but it was a gentle kind of gray, the kind that invited you to linger. The storm had passed completely, yet the sound of its memory lingered in the puddles, in the dripping eaves, in the hush of the waking street. They sat once more by the window, the same chair, the same blanket. The journal lay closed now, its lessons absorbed into silence. Outside, the first drops of a new drizzle began to fall, light and playful, as if the sky wasn't done saying goodbye. Tomorrow begins with drizzle, they murmured. The words half a thought, half a promise. They lifted the cup to their lips. The tea was fresh, its warmth steady and familiar. Beyond the window, the street gleamed, puddles catching bits of light, reflections of roofs and branches painting soft, moving pictures on the ground. A cyclist passed, wheels splashing through water, and the echo of it sounded like laughter. Everything that had been heavy the night before now seemed simple. The waiting, the remembering, the quiet forgiving, all of it had dissolved into this calm. Like ink diluted in rainwater dot, they breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill their lungs, the faint scent of earth still clinging to it. For the first time in a long while, their chest didn't feel tight. It expanded freely, naturally. Maybe that's what patience becomes, they thought. Not stillness, but breath. Not the absence of storms, but the steady rhythm that carries you through them. They thought about how the world would go on today. People hurrying under umbrellas, buses groaning along wet streets, a child tugging their mother's hand, trying to jump in puddles. Life continued, ordinary and beautiful in its persistence. And they were a part of it, quietly, without needing to be anywhere else. They set the cup down and traced their finger along the window pane. The glass was cool, smooth, and a little fogged. On impulse, they drew a small circle. Nothing fancy, just a tiny mark that caught the light. It would fade soon, but for now it felt like a small signature of presence. I was here. I waited. I learned. A gentle wind stirred the curtain, and the room filled with the sound of raindrops brushing against the sill, soft, steady, familiar. The kind of sound that didn't ask for attention, but offered comfort if you happened to listen. They remembered something their grandmother had once said on a morning just like this. After every storm, the world needs quiet people to notice it's beautiful again. They smiled. Maybe that was their task now, not to fix or change, but to notice. To watch the world heal itself in small ways. To honor the pauses between storms. The drizzle thickened for a moment, drops gathering at the edge of the roof before letting go. Each fall was silent, yet together they made music, a soft percussion of patience. They closed their eyes and let it wash over them. Every sound, the rain, the wind, the hum of a distant car, merged into one steady rhythm. It wasn't a lullaby this time. It was something deeper, a reminder that peace didn't come from avoiding the storm, but from learning to walk within it, the trust that even chaos had its gentleness. They whispered, almost to the rain, I don't mind the waiting anymore. Outside, the drizzle sparkled briefly in the pale light. The clouds above began to thin, revealing a faint glow, not sunlight exactly, but the soft shimmer of a day quietly deciding to begin. They stayed there until the cup was emptied, until the tea had cooled and the world outside turned from silver to soft blue. When they finally stood, the air felt lighter around them. They folded the blanket, blew out the candle, and took one last look through the open window. The wind carried a single raindrop inside, landing on their wrist. Cold, surprising, alive. They didn't wipe it away. They let it rest there, glimmering for a moment before it vanished. And as the morning deepened, they whispered to themselves, the storm has passed, but I think I'll stay a little longer, just to listen. The drizzle answered with a quiet, endless rhythm dot. It was enough.